Martin has in recent years specialized in using synthetic sports surfaces and is recognized as being one of the predominant advisors on surfaces in the world. Martin is co founder of Australia's largest community sport and recreation conference, the National Sports Convention, this, with a single aim to encourage more people to be active more and in more places. Please help me welcome Martin Sheppard.
Okay, good morning, I think. Good afternoon, everyone. I have actually been in the industry just over 40 years, unfortunately, but it feels like a brand new day every day. And if you find a job like that, it's not too bad. I started off managing sports and leisure facilities in the UK, and then went up the chain, and then they gave me all the arts and the museums, and then they had another reorganization, and I got all the parks and open spaces. And the one thing I learned from that was just how common the trend was to try and activate people and get people working together. So what our roles were then was really to join the dots. And the role I have now is I've got a consultancy practice where we do leisure planning and the synthetic surfaces. We've got the sports conference where we try to introduce health, wellness, planning, policymakers, advocates together to actually have a better outcome for the community. And then I sit on a couple of technology boards where we try to use data to make decisions based on planning so that it's actually policy driven and connecting all of the dots again. So to look at the third place, really, I'm not coming from an architect side of view, but I am going to look at a practical and a management side. So really, the community has been, the commonality of what we've heard so far has been around living locally, doing it in a sustainable manner, and having a purpose of connection between everything. Third places can be between work, home, and what else we do. History shows, in terms of what James has put up, in terms of what happened 175 years ago in the UK. And it really started in this one place, which is actually Lever Brothers and Port Sunlight in the UK. It's in the northwest of the country, just opposite Liverpool. And it's actually a soap factory. And it started off with a guy called Lord Leverhulme, who actually wanted to sweat his assets. So what he decided to do is not sweat the people, but sweat the assets. So he developed a program where people work for 6 hours a day maximum. And if you look at these conditions, you can understand why. And they had 2 shifts. And then what they did was they actually looked at building an environment around them that made people feel good. So they walked out of that and the family felt good and where they lived. So they built villages around it. And the UK culture is actually about having a pub or a place to go to. So it's really about the men, unfortunately, in those days, actually going around to the pubs and had somewhere to go and to visit. And as time got on, that thinking evolved. So they introduced culture. So culture in those days was a bit different from today. So their culture included things like art galleries and museums, which is on the far side. And then they started to build shops so everybody could walk within a distance. So when they developed this area called Port Sunlight, they developed it so you could walk into particular areas. But just have a look at how much greenery there is there. So they acknowledged in the 1850s to have a community that felt good, had the energy. They really had to work on providing them with the open space and what was needed. And this was the amount of open space. If you can imagine that around City Road or in South Bank, in terms of the amount of apartments going upwards, but how much is actually being done in terms of where people can spend their time outside of the work environment. So that they used this model and he then took it over to the US and it wasn't accepted because people said you can't run a business if you're only asking people to work 6 hours a day. And if you're only asking them to work half a day and the rest of the time they can have to themselves. So it just didn't fit in. The second example from the early 1800s is actually Swindon. That's in the southwest of the country. So they were famous for building old steam trains and then steam trains into the electric trains. And they had a huge factory there building the locomotives called the GWR Railway. And what they did was they recognized that there was a linkage between people coming to work on time, being more productive, with how they actually live their lives. So they decided to actually start building a village for people to live in, which is the far one on my left. And I had the pleasure when I was in Swindon, working in the council there, to manage all of this. And they also moved into culture. So this was what was called the Mechanics Institute. So really it was a combination of a library, performance space, and a theatre, so that everybody could actually go to that. They then evolved from there and actually started developing swimming pools. So in those days, swimming pools were different from today. So in those days, they predominantly had three pools, a bit like Melbourne City Baths. They had a long pool, which in UK terms was a 33-metre pool. And in that, that was where the public went to basically to wash and to have a bit of fun. It wasn't much more than that. They then had about a 17-metre pool, which is about half the size, which actually had lockers around us, if you like, where you could get changed. So that was for the working class or the lower middle class. And then he actually had some private baths where you could actually go into one room with one person and actually have a proper bath. So they actually developed that to actually keep people healthy and safe and to start the recreation. The other older building to the side of it was actually an old hospital. So this was a commercial company that built the hospital because there were so many accidents in the railway works. So they built this for 8 people. That's all they could cope with. And they had a garden out front to try and reclimatize people once they were getting better. This model was actually used by Bevan from the Labour Party to actually develop the NHS over in the UK. So Swindon was really quite famous for that. And then over and above that, they built schools and they actually built parks because they understood the value of the place outside work and outside the home. They didn't call it a third place then. It was just what was needed to keep people balanced and keep them happy. If we then move to present day, we've actually got the interaction of people where they gather and interact, whether that be at work or at home. And what we're seeing now in the workplace with the co-offices is we're seeing places where people can relax, they can work in relaxing places. What's happening there is I think we're saying and have seen that if people are relaxed and they feel good, they'll be more productive in what they're doing. So people are building this in to make it more productive for what people are up to. The universities are also looking at what's needed for third places. And what we're seeing here is actually places like the University of Canberra, where they're looking at the whole well-being of the community. And in essence, most of these are in gated communities. The world governing body is actually called FISU, so Federation of International Sports Unions. And what they're doing now is looking at healthy campuses. So what's needed for people who study there or work there, to live there, and how do they actually recreate to have the balance in their life? So they've now got healthy campuses, and there are about 50 of them around the globe. And I think there's 2 of them now in Australia. So it's really not even a 20-minute city, it's really a 10-minute city actually within the campus. And then what we also have is local villages, which James spoke about. And even a lot of the councils are now trying to partition, if you like, part of the municipality into little villages so people feel connected to them. We then have leisure places or palaces. And if you look at Canada, they've been doing this since the 1970s, where what we have is a shopping centre, a leisure centre, a community centre, all in one area. And they've really been successful over there on that. But we've also had a lot of success historically within Australia, where we actually have community sports venues as opposed to the marvels, where we integrate sport, the community, and the social side. So a lot of the clubs, and this is one from Benalla, where a lot of the clubs would have on a Monday night one particular cohort, and then they would stay there and they would have an evening meal, or the parents would come down and they'd all join together and have an evening meal. So there's a purpose for going. So it's more than just a sport. And then what we're finding in a lot of those country towns is that the alumni, if you like, of the clubs go back and they have the men's sheds next door to them, etc., or the walking groups. So it really becomes a place where people go. When it's not being used for sport and in the springs, we normally find that they're used as the showgrounds. So again, it's a place being used for many different aspects. We also have the community leisure hubs where we're now starting to see health, community services, sport, fitness, recreation, and passive leisure all being put together. Australia, to be honest, is 30 to 40 years behind what's going on in Canada, Europe, and the UK. We actually developed facilities like this in the mid 80s. And we went away from building a $1 million visit centers to actually community hubs that were used for community services, childcare, yoga, everything like that, as well as a bit of sport. So it's good to see that Australia is now coming along with that. But we also have over here the urbanization of sport and exercise for particular cohorts, where this is actually taken from France as an example, between really quite a cultural area where they're putting in acrylic courts to actually encourage young people to go along. And we've seen that also in Melbourne around the CBD, where you've got the universities structured here. But people are using a little bit more imagination now to look at how you can integrate traditional sports that aren't used by a lot of organizations or people with community use. So we've got one here from Copenhagen. So this is a traditional 400-meter athletics track, and I'm actually an athletics coach, so I'm quite passionate about the sport. For God's sake, though, nobody uses rubber tracks except the athletics club. So let's make them a little bit more appealing, both to joggers and runners, other sports, and also different cohorts of the community. Because if they're going to use it and become active, we may actually get something that's used as opposed to spending $2.5 to $3 million gets used of a night time for 2 hours a day. Nothing against athletes, being a coach. But what it does have is the imagination allows it to be used for elite sport. And Copenhagen University is actually, it comes out of an equivalent to the VIS, and it's used by the community. And it's used by young people and by old people. And the older people use it for balance, because there's a lot of research done years ago in Norway that if you actually take people and understand what their problems are, you can develop programs to help them. So over in Norway, they actually worked with the equivalent of our AIS and developed a program with the Winter Institute. And what they did is they set up a obstacle course that went round in a circle. And the first time older people did it, I think the older people were over 65. It took them nearly 10 minutes to do it. After 2 months, they were doing it in under 3 minutes. That gave them the confidence and the balance, and it reduced over 2 years the number of accidents and falls that they had in their own homes. And I think what that does is it shows how health, when health comes to the party and talk with sport, or recreation and physical activity, you can actually have an outcome which is beneficial to the community. As opposed to sport going to health and saying, we're your panacea and this is what we can do. So think about the place and the third place of how we can look at sport being a vehicle for health goals and health outcomes. And we've done this in a number of ways. We've looked at the sustainable development goals, and then we've looked at how that can be used within particular sports facilities. So we've looked at these 8 goals. And from there, we've actually developed a sports concept around the smart sky sports facility. So it's on 4 levels using synthetic technology. What we have on the bottom is a fitness center or a car park, so it generates ongoing revenue. So it's about 8.5 square meters. And then we can put a skateboard park and everything in there. On the first story, we would have 8 five-a-side pitches, which again is a great revenue generator. And then we have 2 half fields that can be used for touch rugby and five-a-side. So the height of the roof is linked to the sport. And then on the top, we actually have an open fenced area, which allows us to then use that for football or any of the rugby codes. So what we can do there is integrate it within a town centre. We can integrate it within a parkland, and we can actually have it so something where all generations can come and use it, which again brings that third place together for the whole family and for all generations. So in terms of what we can learn from the concept of third place and what we've heard today is that it's a place to feel connected, both physically, emotionally, and socially. It's a destination which is easy to access. It has to be local, preferably by walking or cycling, and if necessary, by vehicles. I always find it really ironic that when we build sports facilities, people want the cars next to the sports facilities, so they only have to walk 2 meters. Let's put them out on the side and let's start getting this thoroughfare where people can congregate and walk and feel safe and the place they want to go. It's really about integrating many parts of someone's interests, social, fitness, family, etc. And therefore should connect with people's different needs, whether that be social and eating, exercise, health, about re-energizing. And that's what I think we need to look at when it comes to the third place. So the design strategy really needs to be targeted, understand the cohorts, because a third place for one cohort may actually be very different from another cohort. And we need to just recognize that. And also the life stages. So people will have different expectations depending on whether you're young or whether you're old or very old. And we need to be able to build that in. And sometimes third place isn't about a whole village or a whole town. It could be a closed community like aged care and everything we've heard through COVID. If we actually have better aged care with a third place in there, maybe we'd actually be much better. So that's it from me, just to wrap up what we've heard so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Anyone have any questions for Martin?
Thanks, Martin, and all the other presenters. It's been a very informative session. This is one for you and possibly for everyone else, because everyone's touched on it to some extent, that the idea of the third space and trying to accommodate as many different people as you can, each with their own set of wants and desires. How do you best balance that when you're putting together each of these facilities and accept that possibly some of the people and their wants and needs won't be serviced at all by the facilities that you provide?
That's a really good question. When we do feasibility studies and designs for new facilities, we normally try and start not at the facility, but actually start with the people that you're trying to encourage, activate, whatever, and then work backwards from them and understand what their barriers are or what their activators are. If you understand what their activators are, you can then work out what's the best place for them. If you start at the other end, and I've done a fair bit of work, and there's other consultants in the room, where we get called in by local governments and they say, can you do a business case for this leisure centre? We want a 50-metre pool and we want this, this and this. I'm not sure that's the right way of doing it. I think if you start at the people, understand their barriers, their activators, then go to the place, and then you can decide who actually is the best people to organise it and deliver on it.
All right, Martin, thank